The flashing red and blue lights bounced off the darkened windows of the farmhouse. Sirens wailed in the night, loud enough to shake the stars. Deputies were already in the driveway, their hands resting on their belts, eyes locked on a furious woman stomping towards them. Her face was twisted with rage, her phone clenched in one hand. "I demand you arrest these criminals," she shrieked, jabbing a manicured finger at the confused farm owner. "They're in violation of multiple HOA rules, and I will not stand for this nonsense any longer." One of the deputies, a tall man with tired eyes, tilted his head. "Ma'am, this is private land. There's no HOA out here." Karen, as she had proudly introduced herself to anyone who would listen, gasped like she had been slapped. Her face turned red, but she wasn't done. "Then why is there a rooster crowing at all hours? Why are there muddy tractors ruining the road? Why is that horrid smell in the air? This is unacceptable. This is a civilized neighborhood, not some disgusting—" "Ma'am," the deputy cut her off, voice firm, "we're already here for you." The words hit Karen like a brick. The phone slipped from her fingers, landing in the dirt with a dull thud. Her lips trembled, her confidence faltering for the first time. She looked around as if expecting someone to step in, to defend her, to make sense of what was happening. "We've received multiple complaints about harassment, property damage, and trespassing," the deputy continued, his voice growing colder. "And now, calling 911 under false pretenses? That's another charge." Karen's breath hitched. "No, this is a mistake. I was just—" But the cuffs were already out. 3 weeks earlier. Thomas Carter wiped the sweat from his brow as he surveyed the golden fields stretching beyond his porch. His farm had been the family for generations, and he was proud of every inch of it. The air smelled of fresh soil and hay, the kind of scent that told him he was exactly where he belonged. But peace didn't last long. It started with little things. A nasty note on his mailbox, scrawled in angry red ink. "This is not farmland. Clean up your mess." Then, tire tracks from a fancy SUV cutting through his fields, ruining his crops. And one morning, he found his fence gate wide open, his goats wandering dangerously close to the road. At first, Thomas figured it was some teenagers messing around. But then he saw her, a woman in her 50s, standing stiffly at the edge of his property, arms crossed over her chest. She had a sharp bob haircut and an expression that looked like she had just stepped in cow manure. "You there!" she barked, marching up his driveway like she owned the place. "Do you have any idea how inappropriate this is?" Thomas blinked. "Excuse me. This farm, this chaos. This is a residential neighborhood. There are rules." Thomas chuckled, thinking she was joking. "Ma'am, this land has been a farm since before my granddaddy was born. Ain't no HOA out here." Karen's nostrils flared. "I live right down the street, and I will not tolerate this filth in my community." She didn't live down the street. She lived in a gated neighborhood nearly a mile away. Thomas tried to be patient. "Look, lady, I don't know what your problem is, but this is my land. You don't get a say in what I do here." Karen's face turned an alarming shade of purple. "We'll see about that." She stormed off, but Thomas had no idea that was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. His fence was mysteriously cut in the middle of the night. His mailbox disappeared. Someone filed multiple complaints against him, accusing him of creating a nuisance and violating community standards. Even though he wasn't in an HOA, the county got involved just to shut her up. One evening, Thomas heard the sound of an engine revving outside. He stepped onto his porch just in time to see Karen, of all people, trying to pry a no trespassing sign out of the ground. "Hey!" Thomas bellowed. Karen yelped, jumped back, and scrambled into her SUV. The tires spun, kicking up dirt as she sped off. Thomas had enough. He called the sheriff's office. "This woman's been harassing me nonstop," he said, pacing his kitchen as he explained the situation. "She's trespassing, vandalizing, and I'm pretty sure she's the one letting my animals loose." "We'll look into it," the deputy promised. That should have been the end of it. But Karen wasn't done. The final straw came one crisp autumn morning. Thomas was tending to his horses when he heard it. Sirens. A police car pulled into his driveway. He frowned, walking over to meet the officer stepping out. Before he could ask what was going on, a second car pulled up, then a third. Something wasn't right. Then he saw her. Karen stood on the other side of the road, phone in hand, pointing wildly at him. "He's breaking the law," she screamed. "You need to shut this place down." Thomas barely had time to process what was happening when another car sped up the road, Karen's SUV. She stomped out, clutching her phone like a weapon. "I call 911 because of this filth. Arrest him." The officers exchanged glances. One of them sighed, rubbing his temples. "Ma'am, we're already here." Karen blinked. "Good. Then do something." The deputy fixed her with a look that made her take a step back. "No, ma'am. We're here for you." Karen's smug expression shattered. And that's when everything truly went off the rails. The world seemed to slow as Karen's expression twisted from confusion to sheer panic. She took a step back, clutching her designer purse like a shield. What do you mean? You're here for me?" Deputy Miller, the tall one with the tired eyes, pulled a notepad from his pocket. "Ma'am, we have multiple reports of harassment, trespassing, and property damage tied to you. We were already investigating when you made this call." He paused, glancing at the other officers. "And now you've just added false emergency reporting to the list." Karen let out a laugh, high-pitched, nervous, like a balloon slowly deflating. "This is ridiculous. I'm a victim here. This man," she pointed an accusatory finger at Thomas, "has turned this entire area into a disgusting, smelly nightmare. He has roosters." Miller raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, that's what farms have." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The other officer, a woman named Deputy Owens, crossed her arms. "We have security footage from a neighbor showing you trespassing on Mr. Carter's property multiple times, including attempting to remove posted signs. You were warned already." Karen's face drained of color. That's not trespassing. I was ensuring community safety. Someone had to do something about this filth." Thomas, standing with his arms crossed, finally spoke. "You've slashed my fences, let my animals loose, and had the county breathing down my neck with fake complaints." He gestured at the farm around him. "This land has been in my family for over 100 years. You don't get to just waltz in and decide it needs to be something else." Karen's lip curled in disgust. "You country people are all the same. You think just because you've got some land, you can do whatever you want. Well, let me tell you something." The familiar click of handcuffs snapped the air. Karen froze. Deputy Owens held up the cuffs. "Ma'am, turn around." Karen stumbled back. "No, wait, you can't. You've been warned, and you ignored every chance to stop. You called 911 on an active police investigation." Before we continue, please click the subscribe button for more amazing stories like this. Thank you. Now back to the story. That's a criminal offense. Karen's breath hitched. Her eyes darted around wildly, searching for someone to help. I was just... She turned on her heel and bolted. For a woman in heels, she was surprisingly fast, but she barely made it 10 steps before one of the younger deputies intercepted her. With one swift motion, he grabbed her arm, stopping her escape. "Let me go," Karen screeched. "You have no idea who I am." Deputy Miller sighed. "You're under arrest, ma'am." As the cuffs snapped around her wrists, Karen let out an ear-piercing shriek that sent a nearby rooster flapping in alarm. Thomas let out a slow breath as the reality of the moment settled in. Karen, the self-proclaimed enforcer of non-existent HOA rules, was finally facing consequences. But then, something happened that no one expected. Karen went completely still. Her head turned ever so slightly, eyes narrowing toward Thomas. And then she smiled. Not a normal smile. A chilling smile. "You think this is over?" she whispered, her voice laced with something dark. "You have no idea what you've done." For the first time, Thomas felt a sliver of unease crawl up his spine. The officers led her toward the patrol car, but Karen kept her eyes locked on him. She didn't scream or fight anymore. She simply sat in the back seat, her eerie smirk never fading. And as the doors slammed shut, Thomas realized one terrifying truth. Karen wasn't done. She was just getting started. 1 month earlier, Thomas had always been a patient man. Running a farm required patience. Waiting for crops to grow, for animals to mature, for the seasons to change. He had dealt with wild weather, stubborn animals, and even the occasional nosy neighbor. But nothing had prepared him for her. The first time he saw Karen, he thought she was lost. She had pulled her gleaming white SUV up to the edge of his property, her tinted windows rolling down just enough for her sharply manicured nails to tap against the glass. "Excuse me." Thomas wiped his hands on his jeans and walked over, expecting to give directions. "Can I help you?" Karen gave a tight-lipped smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, you can. I'm from Maplewood Estates, the new neighborhood down the road." Thomas nodded. He had heard about it. A cluster of luxury homes that had popped up a year ago, filled with people looking for country charm without actually living in the country. "Well," Karen continued, "we've been having some concerns." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Concerns?" Karen sighed dramatically, waving a hand toward his farm. "You have animals, and they make noise." Thomas blinked. "It's a farm." "Yes, but we were under the impression this was a developing area." Thomas narrowed his eyes. "Developing into what?" Karen gave another tight smile. "A community, a proper, respectable one." Now Thomas laughed. "Lady, this land isn't part of your neighborhood. I own this farm. Been in my family for generations." Karen's smile faltered. "Well, that's unfortunate," she murmured, as if she had just learned someone had died. "I had hoped you'd be reasonable, but I can see we're going to have a problem." She drove off before he could respond, kicking up a cloud of dust as her SUV sped away. Thomas shook his head, thinking it was over. But Karen wasn't the kind of person who accepted no for an answer. First, the notes appeared. Neatly folded pieces of paper tucked into his mailbox, onto his front porch, even under the windshield wiper of his truck. All written in the same dramatic, cursive handwriting. "Your farm is a disgrace. Consider selling before it's too late. You don't belong here." Then, the complaint started. County inspectors showed up, claiming they had received reports of illegal structures on his land. Animal control was called, multiple times, because someone had reported dangerous livestock. Every single complaint was bogus. But it didn't matter. Karen wasn't trying to win. She was trying to wear him down. And the worst part? She wasn't alone. One night, Thomas spotted 3 figures near his fence line. When he shined his flashlight, they scattered, but he caught a glimpse of their clothes. Expensive jackets, designer shoes. Karen's people. That's when he knew. This wasn't just some petty neighbor dispute. This was war. Present day. Thomas stood outside his barn, watching as a patrol car carrying Karen disappeared down the dirt road. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt something much worse. Because Karen had smiled. Because Karen had warned him. And because, deep down, Thomas knew one thing for certain. She would be back. And next time, she wouldn't be alone. The farm felt unusually quiet the next morning. The sun was up, casting its early rays across the golden fields, and everything seemed normal, at least on the surface. Thomas walked out to check on his horses, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest after Karen's arrest. He had done what he could to put an end to it, but deep down, he knew it wasn't over. That night, he had hardly slept, tossing and turning in bed, the image of Karen's eerie smile replaying in his mind. There was something about it that fell off. It wasn't just the smile itself. It was the certainty in her eyes. The knowing look that suggested she had something planned, something bigger than anything he'd seen so far. He had told the deputies that Karen would come back with a vengeance, but no one had taken him seriously. After all, she was arrested, right? She had to be done. But Thomas knew better. He had lived too long to trust that people like her just walked away after a loss. Later that day, a knock at his front door jolted him from his thoughts. He wasn't expecting anyone. When he opened it, there was no one there. Just a thick, white envelope resting on his doorstep. He bent down cautiously and picked it up, noticing the handwriting immediately. It was the same cursive script he had seen before, the notes, the letters. "This isn't over, Thomas. You've made a powerful enemy. Prepare yourself. You will regret ever crossing me." Karen. His heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a threat. This was a declaration of war. But there was more. Inside the envelope, along with the note, was a small photograph. a black and white shot of his barn, taken from a distance. It looked harmless at first, just another random shot. But then Thomas saw it. The corner of the barn where he kept his equipment was just a little too dark. Someone had been there. His pulse quickened. Someone had been watching his farm. He closed the door behind him, heart racing, and locked it. Then, with trembling hands, he dialed the sheriff's office. "Deputy Owens, I need to report something." She picked up immediately, her voice warm but businesslike. "What's going on, Mr. Carter?" "I just had another note. It's from Karen. And this time it's not just words. She's been here, watching me. Someone's been spying on my property." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Are you sure?" "I'm positive. I found a photo, and there's no way someone just happened to take it from that angle. They were here. I'll send someone to take a look. Stay inside, Thomas. Don't take any chances." Thomas didn't need to be told twice. He hung up the phone, pacing back and forth in his living room. His eyes kept darting to the window, as if expecting to see something or someone just out of sight. It was just before dusk when Deputy Owens arrived with 2 other officers. They immediately began scanning the property. It wasn't long before one of the officers, a younger man named Deputy Fletcher, called out to the others. "I found something," he shouted. Thomas's heart dropped into his stomach as he jogged toward the sound of his voice. Fletcher was crouched down near the edge of the property, right by a line of thick trees. He was staring at the ground, his flashlight bouncing over something that seemed out of place. "What is it?" Thomas asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Fletcher pointed to the ground. There in the dirt was a series of fresh tire tracks, too small to be from any of Thomas's vehicles. They led up to a spot in the woods where the trees thinned out. "This just appeared. Looks like someone parked here recently." "Who?" Thomas asked, feeling his pulse spike again. "I don't know, but it's worth looking into," Fletcher said. The 3 officers walked along the tire tracks, their boots crunching on the dirt, the tension in the air palpable. The tracks led to a small clearing at the edge of the woods, where the trees opened up to reveal a view of the farm. Thomas froze. Across the clearing, half hidden by a thick bush, was a large black SUV. The same model Karen had been driving. "I knew it," Thomas muttered under his breath. Deputy Owens stepped forward, her face grim. "Someone's been using this spot to watch you, Thomas. And if I'm right, that's illegal." Thomas didn't respond. He was too focused on the SUV. The engine was off, but it was clear someone had been there recently. Fletcher leaned closer. "We need to check it out. Now." "Wait," Thomas said, a sudden thought striking him. "Karen's in jail. She can't be the one driving this, can she?" Deputy Owens shook her head. "No, she's locked up. But whoever's helping her, they're not as careful as they think." The officers approached the SUV cautiously. It was parked with its back facing the woods, the rear window slightly fogged. As they got closer, Owens motioned for them to stop. "Something's not right," she said, her voice low. Fletcher pulled out a pair of gloves and opened the passenger door. The interior was neat, the smell of leather and cologne heavy in the air. But when he reached into the glove compartment, his hand froze. Inside was a stack of papers, several of them crumpled. They didn't look official, more like personal notes. The officers exchanged glances. Thomas felt a cold chill run down his spine. "What's in there?" Owen stepped forward and reached for the papers. She unfolded one and scanned it quickly, her face hardening. "Blueprints," she said quietly. "Blueprints for your property." Thomas stared at her. "Blueprints." She handed him the paper. "They're planning something, and it involves you." The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just Karen causing trouble anymore. Someone had been plotting, and they were getting ready to make their move. Thomas stared at the blueprint, his hands shaking slightly as he held the paper. The lines were sharp and meticulous, detailing every corner of his property. The barn, the fields, the stables, every inch of the land he had worked so hard to build. But what stood out to him most were the markings. Red X's drawn across the property, indicating where something was to be taken or altered. "They're going to try to tear down parts of my farm," he said, his voice barely a whisper, as if saying it aloud might make it more real. Deputy Owens nodded grimly. "Looks like it. And based on the notes I'm seeing here, they're not planning on doing it legally." Fletcher squatted down to get a better look at the documents. He flipped through the stack, finding more papers that seemed to be filled with detailed plans and notes about various parts of the land. Thomas had seen blueprints before, but these weren't ordinary plans. They were designed with precision, almost too precise for someone with a clear intent. The plans weren't about renovating a house or building new barns. No, these plans seemed to have one purpose: to take his land. Whoever is behind this, they've been watching you for a while, Owen said, her voice tight. They know your routine, your layout. They've studied every inch of your property. Thomas felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He thought back to the earlier warning Karen had given him. You will regret ever crossing me. It made sense now. This wasn't just about her trying to make his life difficult with noise complaints or fake reports. This was about control. She wanted his land, and she was willing to go to extreme lengths to get it. Fletcher stood up, his face hardening. We need to figure out who's helping her. Someone with resources, someone who knows what they're doing. This isn't just a petty neighborhood dispute anymore. This is a full-on operation. Thomas swallowed, his mouth dry. What do we do now? We take this straight to the sheriff, Owen said firmly. We'll need to investigate further, talk to the neighbors, see if anyone's seen anything unusual around here. We'll get a search warrant if we need to. But just as she said that, Thomas heard a rustling noise from behind them, coming from the woods. His heart skipped a beat as he turned around, half expecting to see someone approaching. A figure emerged from the trees, stepping out into the clearing. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in dark clothes that blended into the shadows. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Who are you? Thomas demanded, taking a step forward, trying to keep his voice steady despite the alarm rising inside him. The man didn't respond. Instead, he simply raised his hand slowly, showing that he wasn't carrying any weapons, at least not visible ones. Thomas was about to take another step when Owens moved swiftly, blocking his path and positioning herself between him and the stranger. Who are you? She repeated, her tone now much firmer. The man paused before speaking, his voice low and even. I'm just here to make sure nothing goes wrong. The words hung in the air like a threat. Make sure nothing goes wrong? Fletcher asked, his tone skeptical. What does that even mean? The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze shifted toward Thomas, scanning him up and down as though measuring him. You made a lot of noise, Carter. The wrong kind of noise. And now you're a problem. Thomas's blood ran cold. A problem? He repeated, trying to keep his voice steady. What kind of problem? The stranger finally spoke again, his voice colder now. You're in the way, and people who get in the way, they tend to disappear. Fletcher tensed, clearly ready for a confrontation. But Owens, more experienced, stepped in front of him, raising her hand to stop any hasty action. You need to leave now, she said, her voice firm but controlled. We're not interested in threats. The man seemed unfazed by her command. Slowly, he took a step backward, his eyes still locked on Thomas. This isn't over, he said quietly. You should be careful, very careful. Then, without another word, he turned and melted back into the trees. Thomas stood frozen, his mind racing. The man's words echoed in his head. People who get in the way, they tend to disappear. The officers stood there for a moment, their expressions grave. That was too close, Owens muttered, her eyes scanning the woods. We don't know who that was, but I'll bet it's connected to Karen. We need to get back to the station and figure out who else is involved in this. Thomas nodded, his stomach turning. I think Karen's not working alone. She's got people backing her up. People with power, people who can make things happen. We'll find out who they are, Fletcher said. But right now, we need to get you somewhere safe. That man's not going to stop, and we can't guarantee your safety out here alone anymore. Thomas glanced back at his farm, the place that had been his home for as long as he could remember. For a moment, it looked peaceful, but beneath that calm, something dark was lurking. He turned to the officers. Let's go. Let's get to the sheriff's office. As they made their way back toward the patrol cars, the silence weighed heavily on Thomas. Karen's words, her warning, echoed in his mind. You will regret crossing me. It felt like he was already starting to. The ride to the sheriff's office was unnervingly quiet. The patrol cars rumbled down the winding road. The only sounds the hum of the engine and the occasional crackling from the police radio. Thomas sat in the back of one of the cruisers, his hands resting on his knees, staring blankly out the window. The threat from a stranger still echoed in his mind, like a shadow he couldn't shake. People who get in the way, they tend to disappear. It was only when they pulled into the sheriff's office parking lot that Thomas snapped out of his thoughts. The old brick building loomed in front of him, a familiar sight. But today it felt different. The walls didn't seem so sturdy. The windows didn't feel as safe. Owens glanced over her shoulder at him as they parked. "You okay?" Thomas nodded, though he didn't feel okay. "I just don't get it. Why would they go this far? What do they want with my farm?" "We'll figure it out," Owens reassured him, though there was a touch of uncertainty in her voice. Fletcher, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up as they exited the car. "We're going to need to dig deeper. This isn't just about property disputes. They're after something big, something more than just land. I think Karen's part of something much bigger." Thomas didn't say anything as they entered the building. He felt the weight of the situation sinking in. The sheriff's office felt smaller, less welcoming, now that he knew people were watching him, people who didn't hesitate to make threats. Inside, the sheriff himself, a large man with graying hair and a thick mustache, stood by a desk, flipping through a stack of papers. When he saw them walk in, he set them down and motioned for them to sit. "Deputy Owens, Deputy Fletcher," he greeted them before his gaze landed on Thomas. "And Mr. Carter, good to see you again, though I wish it were under better circumstances." Thomas sat down, the chair creaking under his weight. "What's going on? What do we know?" The sheriff leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. "Not much, Mr. Carter. We've had reports of harassment, trespassing, and property damage, but no solid leads. The investigation's been slow. However, after that last bit with the stranger in the woods, I don't like where this is going." Owens nodded. That man, he was too confident. He knew Thomas's routine, his property, everything. He wasn't just some random thug. He's connected. The sheriff crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. "I agree. And if Karen is involved, it's more than just personal vendettas. She's got someone behind her." Fletcher spoke next. "We've got blueprints of Mr. Carter's property, Sheriff. Detailed ones. They show spots where someone plans to come in and tear things down, alter parts of the farm. It's clear someone's planning an operation, one that involves more than just Karen." The sheriff's eyebrows shot up. "Blueprints, you say? That's not something she could have gotten on her own. She's involved with something much bigger than just being a nuisance." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying someone's trying to take your farm, Mr. Carter. And they've been planning it for a while. We need to figure out who's behind this, fast." Owens nodded. "I've been going through some of the records. I found a name that keeps coming up in connection with Karen. A man named Robert Foster." Thomas frowned. "Who's Robert Foster?" "Foster is a businessman. Owns a construction company. Big one. He's been involved in a lot of deals around the area, and a lot of those deals have raised some eyebrows. He's been buying up properties left and right, but for some reason, he's never been connected to any of the shady stuff." Owens paused, her eyes locked on Thomas. "But I think that's the connection. Karen's not just some random woman with a vendetta. She's working with him." "Foster," Thomas repeated, the name heavy on his tongue. He had heard of him, always in the background, always lurking. He was a name that popped up in business dealings and local politics, but never in connection with anything illegal. Owens continued. "We think Foster has his eyes on your land. He's the one who's been backing Karen's efforts, probably funding her threats, the harassment. He's not just looking to take your farm, though. He wants the entire area, and he'll do whatever it takes to get it." Fletcher shifted uncomfortably in his seat. If Foster is the one behind this, things are about to get a lot more dangerous. We need to move fast. The sheriff stood up, a look of determination settling over his face. "We'll start digging into Foster's background, see if we can get any information about his plans. But for now, Mr. Carter, I want you to stay somewhere safe. Don't go back to the farm." Thomas shook his head. "I can't just leave. It's my home." "I know it is, son," the sheriff said, his tone softening for a moment. "But it's not safe anymore. If Foster and Karen are after your farm, They won't hesitate to do whatever it takes to get it. The sooner we can stop them, the better. Thomas hesitated. He knew the sheriff was right. But leaving his land behind felt like admitting defeat. Fine, but I want to be involved. I want to know what's going on. We'll keep you in the loop, don't worry, Owens said, giving him a reassuring look. Just as she spoke, her phone buzzed. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen before her face grew serious. I've got something. We need to go. The sheriff stood up and grabbed his coat. Let's go. Everyone, stay sharp. This could be our break. As they made their way out of the office, Thomas's mind raced. He had been living in peace on his farm for years, working hard and keeping to himself. Now, he was caught in the middle of something much bigger than he ever imagined. People were trying to take what was his family's land, his home. And he wasn't about to let that happen. The sheriff's office was abuzz with activity as they made their way back to the cars. Deputy Owens was talking rapidly on the phone, her brows furrowed in concentration. The others were preparing for something, gearing up for whatever they had planned next. Thomas couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Everything had changed so quickly. It felt like just yesterday he was peacefully working on his farm, tending to his animals, taking care of his crops. Now, his life was consumed by threats, by people who wanted to take everything from him. Mr. Carter, we need to move fast, the sheriff said, breaking Thomas from his thoughts. We've got a lead on Foster's operation. If he's been hiding something, now's the time to find it. Owens ended the call, slipping her phone into her pocket. We just got word from one of our informants. They spotted Foster meeting with someone who's been connected to a series of shady business deals around here. We're going after them now. Thomas felt a surge of urgency rise in him. What are you waiting for? Let's go. We need to stop them before they do something crazy. The sheriff gave him a stern look. Calm down, son. We're going in with a plan. Thomas nodded, his hands clenched into fists. He didn't want to wait. Every minute that passed felt like another minute Foster and Karen were getting closer to taking his land. As they drove, the air inside the cruiser felt thick with tension. Thomas sat in the back again, staring out the window. He had spent his whole life building his farm, protecting it, and now, in a matter of weeks, it had become the target of something far beyond his control. They're not just after your farm, Thomas, Owens said, as though reading his mind. This is about power. Control. Foster wants more than land. He wants influence. He's been trying to expand his empire by taking properties that connect to valuable development land. And your farm, it's in the perfect spot. Thomas frowned. So this isn't just about me, then? No, Owens confirmed. It's about everything around here. If Foster can get your land, he'll have a bigger stake in the area. And we think he's using Karen as a pawn to get what he wants. But there's something else. He's not just an investor. We've heard rumors that he's been involved in a number of unsavory deals. We don't have all the details yet, but he's dirty. Thomas gritted his teeth. I didn't ask for any of this. I know, the sheriff said sympathetically, but you're in the middle of it now, and we're going to make sure you don't lose everything. The car turned down a narrow dirt road that led toward a cluster of buildings at the edge of the town. The sheriff glanced in the rearview mirror, making sure they weren't being followed. Stay alert, Owens instructed. This could be dangerous. They pulled up to a warehouse tucked away behind a row of old buildings. The area was secluded, far from the main roads. It looked abandoned, but Thomas could sense that something was going on there. He could feel the weight of the moment settle over him, the kind of moment where everything was on the line. This is it, the sheriff said quietly, turning off the engine. Everyone, keep your radios on. We move fast, no mistakes. They stepped out of the car, weapons holstered but ready, and made their way toward the warehouse. The area was unnervingly quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic on the nearby highway. The rusted metal doors of the warehouse were closed, but a small crack of light leaked through, just enough to make Thomas's heart race. Let's do this, Owens said. With that, they approached the side of the building, staying low, moving quickly but carefully. The sheriff led the way, checking every corner, making sure there were no surprises waiting for them. As they neared the back of the warehouse, Thomas saw something that made his stomach drop, a group of men moving around the corner. They were talking, but in the low, muffled voices that made it clear they didn't want to be heard. Foster was among them. Thomas could make out his face as he turned toward one of the men, laughing as they exchanged some sort of plan. "Quiet," Owens whispered. They moved even closer, the crunch of gravel beneath their feet barely audible. Thomas's mind was spinning. This was it. This was the moment when everything could change. "We need to get closer," Fletcher murmured. As they edged forward, a loud creak echoed from the warehouse door. The group of men froze, their heads snapping toward the noise. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. They were too close now. There was no turning back. The sheriff motioned for them to take cover behind some old crates stacked against the building. They crouched low, trying to remain unseen. The group of men didn't move for a long moment, as if waiting for the sound of footsteps to fade. Then, one of the men, the one closest to the door, spoke. "We're not getting out of here unnoticed. Someone's been tailing us. We need to hurry up and finish this." Foster's voice rang out, a cold, calculated tone that sent a chill through Thomas's spine. "No one will stop us. Not now. We're too close to pulling this off. Carter's farm is just the beginning." Thomas's blood ran cold. They were talking about him. They were talking about his farm. They were planning something. Something big. Without thinking, Thomas pushed himself to his feet, moving quickly, ignoring the commands from the sheriff to stay down. He had to hear more. He had to know what they were planning. Just as he rounded the corner to get a better view, a loud bang rang through the air, followed by the sound of boots pounding against the ground. "Get down," Owen shouted, pulling him back behind the crates just as a shot rang out. The world seemed to slow as the group of men scattered in every direction. Thomas's heart was pounding so hard in his chest that he couldn't hear anything else. All he could think about was the single, terrifying realization. They had been spotted, and they were coming for them. The shot had come from nowhere. One moment, everything was still, and the next, the sound of a bullet slamming into the dirt just feet away sent Thomas's heart into overdrive. He dropped to the ground, his ears ringing, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Get down," Owens shouted again, pulling him even lower behind the stack of crates. The sound of footsteps grew louder as the men scattered. It was chaos. They hadn't just been discovered. They were under attack. Thomas's mind raced. The men, including Foster, had to be part of something much bigger, something dangerous. And now they were all on the move. He couldn't just sit back and wait anymore. He had to act. Another shot rang out, this one closer, and the sheriff yelled for everyone to stay low. The men were circling around, likely trying to pin them down. "We need to move," Fletcher hissed, his voice strained with urgency. Owens looked around quickly. "We can't just rush in. They're armed, and we don't know how many there are." Thomas's mind whirled. He had to think fast. He could feel his pulse in his throat, the air thick with tension. The men knew they were here, and there was no way they were just going to let the officers go without a fight. "Thomas," Owens said, her voice sharp, "stay with me." Thomas barely heard her. His eyes scanned the area. If they stayed here, they would be sitting ducks. But if they tried to move, they would be exposed. Then he saw it, a way out. There was a small gap between the warehouse and the barn just up ahead. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make a break for it. If they could get to the barn, they could regroup, take cover, and plan their next move. "We're going for the barn," Thomas said, voice low but determined. Owens didn't hesitate. She nodded, signaling to Fletcher. "On 3, she whispered. 1, 2. Before she could finish, Thomas was already moving, darting between the crates. His legs burned as he sprinted for the gap in the fence, his heart pounding in his chest. Another shot rang out. Thomas could hear the man's angry shout, the sound of feet pounding the gravel. They were right behind them. He made it to the barn, pulling open the large wooden door just enough to slip through. Owens and Fletcher followed close behind. Inside, the barn smelled of hay and dust. The familiar sent a small comfort in the middle of everything falling apart. "We got to hold up here for now," Owens said, pushing the door shut behind them. "They'll be searching for us." Thomas nodded, trying to catch his breath. He leaned against the barn wall, his eyes darting around as he heard the sounds of footsteps outside. The men were looking for them. He could hear the faint calls, the shuffling of boots on the dirt. "They're getting closer," Fletcher said quietly, glancing toward the barn door. "We can't stay here long," Owens said. "We need to make sure we're not cornered." Thomas's mind raced. They couldn't stay in the barn forever. They needed a plan, and fast. But what could they do? They were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded by people who weren't afraid to kill to get what they wanted. A sudden idea struck him, and he turned to Owens. "What if we use the farm's old irrigation system?" She looked at him, confused. "The irrigation system?" "Yes," he said, his pulse quickening. "It runs through the fields. If we can get to the control valve, we can flood the fields and create a barrier. It'll buy us some time to get away." Fletcher's eyes lit up with understanding. "If we do that, we'll slow them down. It's not perfect, but it'll give us a shot." Owens nodded, her expression hardening. "All right, let's move. But we have to be quick." They made their way out of the barn as quietly as possible, slipping through the back door and crouching low in the tall grass. The irrigation system was at the far end of the property, past the barn, behind a row of trees. If they could get there undetected, they might just have a chance. The air was thick with tension as they crept toward the system. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest, every noise amplified in the eerie silence of the night. The sounds of the men searching nearby sent chills down his spine. They reached the valve. Thomas's hands were shaking as he turned it, the familiar creak of the rusty wheel turning against him. Water rushed from the pipes, pouring out in a powerful stream. The sound of rushing water was deafening. It was working. The field would soon be flooded, slowing the men down, blocking their path. "We've done it," Fletcher said, his voice low. "Now, what?" Owens's expression was grim. "Now we get out of here. We need to move fast." As they turned to head toward the trees, a voice suddenly cut through the air, sharp and demanding. There they are. The men had found them. They were too late. Thomas's blood ran cold as he looked up, seeing the silhouette of a man standing at the edge of the field, pointing straight at them. "They've got us," Owens muttered, reaching for a gun. "Move! Now!" the sheriff shouted, his voice commanding. The group sprinted toward the tree line, the sound of shouting men chasing them. Thomas's mind raced as he pushed himself harder, his legs burning with every step. They had no choice now but to run. But as they neared the trees, a figure stepped out from the shadows ahead of them, blocking their path. It was Foster, and he was holding a gun. Thomas froze, his breath caught in his throat. Foster's lips curled into a cold smile. "You really thought you could run from this, Carter? You're mine now." The gun glinted in the moonlight, and for the first time, Thomas realized just how deep he was in this. Foster had won. The air felt like it had been sucked out of the world, leaving only silence and the weight of Foster's gun aimed straight at Thomas. Every muscle in Thomas's body tensed, ready to move, but unsure of what to do. The man in front of him, Foster, was calm, almost too calm. His expression was a mix of smug satisfaction and cold calculation. "You don't have to do this," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper, trying to keep the desperation from creeping in. He didn't want to beg. He had worked too hard, fought too much, to end up cowering in front of this man. But the gun, Foster's calm stare, made him feel small. "Oh, I do," Foster replied, his smile widening just slightly. "You see, Carter, this was never about you. This was about the land, about the bigger picture. You're just a small obstacle in my path. I've been patient, but now it's time to end this little game of yours." Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. There was nothing left to say. Everything they had fought for, everything they had tried to protect, was about to slip away. The sound of footsteps suddenly broke through the tension. Fast, heavy. "Don't you dare point that gun at him, Foster!" Owens shouted from behind them, her voice sharp and full of authority. Before Thomas could react, he felt a sudden surge of hope. He turned just in time to see Owens and Fletcher darting toward them, weapons drawn, moving fast. But Foster was ready. Without hesitation, he leveled his gun at them. "Stay back," he yelled, his voice cold as ice. Everything seemed to slow down in that moment. The gun in Foster's hand, the determination in his eyes, the sound of the rushing water still flowing through the fields. It all felt like it was happening in slow motion. Then, out of nowhere, a shot rang out. Foster staggered back, his hand jerking as the bullet grazed his shoulder. It wasn't from Owens or Fletcher. Thomas blinked in disbelief, trying to figure out what had just happened. His heart skipped a beat as a figure emerged from the shadows, moving fast, low to the ground. It was the sheriff. "Sheriff!" Owens shouted, her eyes wide with relief. Foster cursed under his breath, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "You think this changes anything? You're too late." The sheriff didn't flinch. He was calm, controlled, his gun still aimed at Foster. "I don't think so, Robert," he said, his voice steady. "You're finished." Foster gritted his teeth, his eyes full of rage as he tried to adjust his grip on the gun. He was furious, but it was clear that he was wounded, weak. He couldn't win this fight now. "You can't just walk away from this," Foster spat, blood dripping from his shoulder. "I've worked too hard. You think you can stop me now? You're nothing." The sheriff moved forward, his voice hard and cold. "You're done, Robert. It's over. You've been playing a dangerous game, and now it's time for you to face the consequences." Foster looked around at the officers, the gun in his hand slowly lowering as he realized he was out of options. "You think I'm the only one?" He sneered, his lips curling into that same cold, twisted smile. "You're not stopping anything. There are bigger forces at play here. You think arresting me will end it? You have no idea what's coming." Thomas felt a chill run through him at the mention of bigger forces, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. He was just relieved that they had caught Foster, finally. "Put the gun down, Robert," the sheriff said again, stepping closer. "It's over." For a moment, Foster seemed to waver, caught between surrender and defiance. Then, with a growl of frustration, he let the gun fall to the ground, his body slumping slightly as if the fight had drained out of him. The sheriff moved in swiftly, handcuffing him. "You're under arrest for harassment, conspiracy to commit property damage, attempted assault, and several other charges. You got a long time to think about your actions." Thomas stood there, breathing heavily, still trying to process everything that had just happened. It felt like the world was spinning. He had almost lost everything: his farm, his family's legacy, and it was only by the narrowest of margins that he had escaped. Fletcher moved forward, taking the gun from the ground and securing it in a holster. Owens kept her eyes on Foster, making sure he didn't try anything. Thomas turned to the sheriff, his voice shaky. "What does he mean by bigger forces? Is this really over?" The sheriff looked at him, his face serious. "I don't know, but I don't like what he said. There's something more to this. This wasn't just a random land grab. If Foster was working with someone else, someone more powerful, then this is just the beginning." Thomas felt his stomach twist into knots again. He thought they had won, but now he realized it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The sheriff glanced over at Owens, who nodded. "We'll figure it out. We got a lot of work to do. But for now, Thomas, you're safe." Thomas didn't know if he felt safe. Not completely. The threat from Foster had been real, and now there was talk of bigger forces that still loomed over him like a dark cloud. For now, though, they had caught the man behind it all. Foster would be in custody, but in the back of Thomas's mind, he knew that whatever this was, whatever dangerous game Foster and his people had been playing, it wasn't over. Not yet. The sheriff's office was abuzz with activity as the dawn broke. The early morning light streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the desk where Sheriff Walker sat, flipping through the thick file on Robert Foster. Thomas had been sitting there for hours, his mind still racing from the events of the night before. The arrest of Foster had felt like a victory, until he heard those chilling words. Bigger forces. The sheriff's office was quieter now, but the air was thick with tension. Owens and Fletcher were going over the evidence, making sure they had everything they needed for the case. Meanwhile, Thomas couldn't sit still. He had come so close to losing everything. The thought of it sent his mind spiraling. "Thomas, come on. We need to talk." Thomas snapped out of his daze and looked up. Owens was standing in the doorway of the sheriff's office, her eyes filled with concern. "You all right?" she asked. He nodded, but it was more out of habit than honesty. "I don't know. I keep thinking about what Foster said." "About the bigger forces?" she asked, her voice low. Thomas nodded. "Yeah. What do you think he meant by that? Who's behind all of this?" Owens hesitated before sitting down across from him. I don't know, but I don't like the sound of it. Foster wasn't acting like a regular criminal. He was too calm, too composed, almost like he knew we'd catch him eventually. That kind of confidence doesn't come from just being rich or powerful. It comes from connections, from people who can protect you. People who can make things happen. Thomas murmured, his stomach sinking. Exactly, Owens replied. That's what I'm worried about. This isn't just a one-man show. Foster may have been the face of it, but I think he was working for someone. And that someone had a lot more power than just one shady businessman. The sheriff walked into the room, interrupting their conversation. His face was drawn, but there was a new intensity in his eyes. We've got a problem, he said without preamble, tossing a file on the desk in front of them. Thomas leaned forward, eyes narrowing. What is it? I've been going through Foster's records, the sheriff said, flipping open the file. And I found something. He pointed to a series of names, business deals, and offshore accounts. Foster's been connected to a whole web of developers, politicians, and investors. People who have been buying up property, land, lots of it. And all of it is connected to you. Thomas felt a cold chill run down his spine. What do you mean, connected to me? The sheriff flipped the page. It's all in these contracts. Foster's been eyeing land around here for a while now, but he didn't want it just for development. He wanted control, and he thought taking your farm would be his ticket to getting all of it. He's been working with some very influential people to try and take over this entire area. And I don't think you were the first target. Thomas's mind reeled. This wasn't just about his farm. It was bigger than that. It was about a whole stretch of land, a piece of the puzzle that had been deliberately constructed to make the area more valuable. And now, Thomas realized he was standing in the way of something far bigger than he had ever imagined. What happens now? Owens asked, her voice steady but tense. We start digging into these connections, the sheriff said, his tone grim. We need to find out who's really behind this, who's pulling the strings. And we need to move fast. Foster may be in custody, but the people he was working with are still out there. They won't stop just because we caught him. Fletcher walked into the room, his face tight. I've been running background checks on some of the names in those contracts. And it's worse than I thought. We've got developers with ties to powerful people in Washington, D.C., even some international connections. We're talking about serious money here, Thomas. They've got resources, connections. This is more than just a land grab. It's about influence, power, and control. Thomas felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He had no idea what he had gotten himself into. His farm, his home, had become a battleground in a much bigger war, and he wasn't sure how to fight it. We need to be prepared for anything, the sheriff said, looking at Thomas. This isn't over. Foster might be locked up, but we've got to make sure his network doesn't just sweep this under the rug. If they want your farm, they'll come after you again. They'll come after everything. Thomas clenched his fists. I'm not going to let them take my land. Not without a fight. The sheriff nodded. Good. That's the right attitude. But we need to play it smart. We'll have to build a case, get more evidence. We might have to go after these people legally through the courts. But we need to make sure they know they can't just steamroll you. You have to stay strong, Thomas. You can't back down now. I won't, Thomas said, his voice firm. I've worked too hard for this. My family has worked too hard. I'm not letting anyone take it from me. Owen stood up, her expression serious. We'll need your full cooperation. We'll be watching every move they make, getting every piece of evidence we can. But we need to move carefully. These people won't hesitate to do whatever it takes to get what they want. And we're not just talking about legal pressure. We're talking about real threats. Thomas nodded, his resolve hardening. Then let's go after them. Let's take this fight to them and show them they can't win. The sheriff gave him a small smile, but it was tight. That's the spirit. But we have to be careful. You're not alone in this, Thomas. We're all in this together. But as Thomas looked around the room, something nagged at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. That whatever bigger forces Foster had been talking about, whoever they were, hadn't shown their full hand yet. And in the back of his mind, Thomas couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. The next few days blurred together. Sheriff Walker and his team worked relentlessly to piece together the tangled web of connections that surrounded Robert Foster. As they uncovered more and more about the powerful developers, political figures, and business tycoons involved, it became clear that this wasn't just some local squabble over land. It was part of a larger, more dangerous game. Thomas spent his days pacing the house, unable to stay still. Every phone call, every knock at the door made his heart race. He had been on edge ever since Foster's arrest, his mind constantly turning over the implications of everything he had learned. The sheriff's office had stepped up its surveillance on his property, and Owens and Fletcher had been monitoring the situation closely. But no matter how much they investigated, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still out there. Every time he looked out the window, it seemed like the world was a little quieter, a little more ominous. His farm, once a place of peace and routine, had become a battleground, and he was stuck in the middle of it. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Thomas was sitting on the porch, staring at the fields. The wind blew softly, rustling the leaves of the nearby trees. It was peaceful, almost idyllic, but it felt out of place. The serenity of the moment only reminded him how much had been stolen from him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the silence. He pulled it out, his eyes scanning the text that had just come through. It was from Owens. "We have a lead. Meet us at the warehouse. Don't trust anyone right now. It's happening." Thomas's heart skipped a beat. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket, slamming the door behind him, and climbed into his truck. His mind was racing as he drove toward the warehouse. He had been here before, the night of the ambush. He remembered the men, the gunfire, the sense of being hunted. Now, there was a new urgency in the air. He had to find out what was going on before it was too late. When he arrived, Owens and Fletcher were already waiting by the entrance, their faces serious and tense. "What's happening?" Thomas asked, his voice strained with the questions that had been building in his mind. "We found something," Owens said, her voice low. "It's not just about land. This goes deeper than we thought. They've got their fingers in everything: politics, law enforcement, business, and we've been getting anonymous tips about who's behind it." Fletcher stepped forward, holding up a folder with several photographs. "We got eyes on a meeting. We think Foster was just the first in a long chain of people trying to force you out." He handed the folder to Thomas. Inside were photos of several men. Some of them Thomas recognized as prominent local figures, and a few he didn't. There were pictures of them meeting in secret locations, some shaking hands with figures in dark suits. The last few photos made Thomas's blood run cold. There, standing in the background of a photo of a high-end restaurant, was a face he hadn't seen in years: Carlson Jennings. Jennings was a powerful, well-known developer from a nearby city who had been involved in multiple land deals. He was the kind of person whose name carried weight. But Thomas had never had any direct dealings with him. What was he doing here? And why was he so involved in his farm? "This man's the key," Owens said. "Jennings has been linked to some of the most dangerous business operations around. If he's involved in this, we're not just dealing with local crooks. We're dealing with someone who has connections at every level." Thomas's mind reeled as he processed the implications. So they're all connected. Foster, Jennings, and all these other people. This is part of a larger operation. They weren't just after my land. They're after everything around here. And I'm just the first obstacle. "That's exactly it," Fletcher said, his voice tight with frustration. "But the problem is, these people don't play by the rules. They've got so much influence that even if we go public with this information, we might not get very far. They've already got the power to silence people. We can't go after them directly. Not yet." Thomas felt a surge of anger. He was sick of hiding, sick of being pushed around by these people. "Then what do we do? Wait for them to strike again?" "No," Owen said firmly. "We go on the offense." She motioned for them to follow her. The three of them walked toward a dark corner of the warehouse, where several large crates were stacked. Owens pulled one aside, revealing a hidden compartment underneath. Inside were several pieces of equipment, records, files, and documents that had been collected from various sources. "These are the real pieces of the puzzle," Owens said, pulling out a manila folder. "We've been compiling evidence. Foster wasn't just working with Jennings. There's more, a network of people we haven't even identified yet. We need to build our case from the ground up." Thomas looked at the documents. There were reports of land grabs, secret meetings, financial records, and correspondence between Foster and powerful figures across the region. It was all coming together. The scope of the operation was bigger than he could have imagined. "But we can't do this alone," Owens said, looking at Fletcher and Thomas. "We need to keep this under wraps for now. If we're not careful, they'll catch on, and we'll lose everything we've worked for. We need more time to dig into Jennings and the rest of this network." Thomas was silent for a moment, staring at the papers in his hands. He knew this was just the beginning. The world he thought he knew was falling apart around him. But he wasn't about to give up. Not now. Not when everything he held dear was on the line. "They can't win," Thomas said, his voice hardening. "They took their first shot at me, and I'm still standing. They're not getting away with this." Owens nodded. "That's the spirit. But we've got to be smart about this. If we move too quickly, we risk tipping them off. We need to be patient, plan every step carefully." Thomas looked out into the darkness, the weight of everything pressing down on him. "Then let's get to work." The next few days were a blur of strategy meetings, late-night phone calls, and piecing together information. Thomas couldn't remember the last time he'd gotten a good night's sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Foster's smug face or the shadow of Carlson Jennings lurking in the background of those photos. Sheriff Walker and his team were working tirelessly to uncover every possible lead, but things were moving slowly. The network was vast, and the deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. They weren't just dealing with local criminals anymore. They were up against people with real power, politicians, business moguls, and developers who had the means to cover their tracks and destroy anyone in their way. Thomas sat at his kitchen table one evening, staring down at a map of the area. The lines of roads, rivers, and fields seemed to blur together in his mind. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about control. And whoever controlled the land controlled the future of the entire region. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, not looking up. The door creaked open, and Owen stepped in, her expression serious. "We got a problem." Thomas sat up, the uneasy feeling in his stomach returning. "What's going on?" "We've been following up on the lead with Jennings," she said, walking over to the table and sitting down across from him. "And we've discovered something alarming." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "What?" Owens paused before continuing. "Jennings isn't just working with Foster. He's been making moves to get control of local resources, water, land, even the public utilities. We've got reason to believe he's planning to completely reshape this area. The land is only the first step. After that, he's aiming for full control of the region's infrastructure." Thomas's heart skipped a beat. "You mean he's planning to take over everything? Water? Utilities?" Owens nodded grimly. "Exactly. And if that happens, people like us, people who don't play along, will be left with nothing. It's a big power grab, and your farm is a piece of it." Thomas leaned back in his chair, trying to process the new information. It was worse than he had thought. This wasn't just about him or his farm. It was about the future of the entire community. "We need to stop him before it's too late," Thomas said, his voice low with determination. "We're not going to stop him unless we have more evidence," Owens replied. "But here's the thing. Jennings is playing a long game. He's not just trying to take your land. He's trying to make sure no one can oppose him in the future. If we don't act now, it'll be too late." Fletcher entered the room then, holding a manila folder, his face pale. "We got some news. It's not good." Thomas's heart sank. "What's happened?" Fletcher set the folder on the table. "We've been tracking Jennings's associates, and they've started making moves. Big ones. We've got intel that suggests they're planning something soon, something that could tip the scales in their favor. It looks like they're planning to seize more land, but this time, it won't be a quiet takeover." "Do we know when?" Owens asked, her voice steady but tense. "Soon. Very soon," Fletcher said. "They're moving fast, and we need to make a decision. If we don't get ahead of this, Jennings and his people will have everything they need to finalize their control." Thomas stood up, slamming his fist on the table in frustration. "We can't let this happen. I won't let them ruin everything." "There's more," Fletcher continued, his voice dropping lower. We think they've already started spreading misinformation about you and your farm. There are rumors going around that your land's been abandoned, that you've been neglecting it, that you're selling out. If people believe those rumors, they might be more inclined to let Jennings take over." Thomas's blood ran cold. "So, they're trying to turn everyone against me?" "Exactly," Owens confirmed. "If they can convince the community that you've given up, that you're not a reliable steward of the land, they can swoop in and offer their help. They'll buy up the land from the local government or make a deal with the HOA, whatever it takes. And we're not just fighting for the farm anymore," Fletcher said, his voice grave. "We're fighting for the future of the entire region." Thomas stared at the map in front of him again, a sense of urgency settling over him. If Jennings was really trying to take control of everything, then this wasn't just a fight for his farm. It was a fight for the entire community's freedom. He felt the weight of it all, the responsibility, the fear, the anger. And for the first time since all this started, he realized just how high the stakes were. "This isn't just about me anymore," he said, his voice resolute. "It's about all of us. We can't let them win." Owen stood up, her expression determined. "We've got a small window of time before Jennings makes his move. We need to find everything we can about his plans, about the people backing him. And we need to go public before it's too late." "But how?" Thomas asked. "How do we expose him when he's got so many people working for him?" "We expose the truth," Owens said. "We gather evidence, speak to the right people, and force the truth out into the open. But we need to move fast." Thomas looked at her, his resolve hardening. "Then let's get to work." The rest of the night was spent planning. Owens, Fletcher, and the sheriff worked with Thomas to gather as much evidence as they could. They compiled documents, followed leads, and prepared their case, knowing that their time was limited. As the clock ticked, Thomas knew one thing for certain. Jennings wouldn't go down without a fight. But he was ready. He had to be. This was his land, his legacy, and he wasn't about to let anyone take it from him. The morning of the public hearing arrived, and with it, the culmination of everything Thomas had been fighting for. The air was heavy with tension as he stood at the steps of the courthouse, flanked by Sheriff Walker, Owens, and Fletcher. Behind them, a crowd had gathered, local farmers, residents, people who lived in the area, all of them concerned about the future of the land they called home. The courthouse was packed, and as Thomas stepped inside, he was met with a wave of whispers and curious eyes. Jennings's people were already there, sitting in the front row, their polished suits and confident smiles contrasting sharply with the determined faces of the locals. The tension in the room was palpable. Thomas took a deep breath as he walked up to the front, his heart beating in his chest. This was it, the final battle. As he stood before the judge, his mind flashed back to everything that had led him here, the notes, the threats, the late-night meetings, the menacing words from Foster and Jennings. It all came down to this moment. He couldn't back down now. The judge, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a stern expression, looked at the crowd and then at the papers in front of him. "We are here today to discuss the future of the Carter farm and the surrounding area," the judge began. "There are claims of misuse of property, as well as allegations of misconduct and conspiracy. The court will hear from both sides." The doors opened, and Jennings stood up, moving to the front with his lawyer beside him. His smug expression hadn't changed. He had a sense of calm, like he knew he was going to win. But Thomas wasn't backing down. Jennings's lawyer began first, presenting a stack of documents that painted Thomas as a negligent landowner, one who couldn't be trusted with the valuable land he owned. The accusations were fabricated, filled with lies about the condition of the property, about Thomas's intentions. It was hard to listen. Every word felt like a slap in the face, but Thomas remained calm. He couldn't let himself lose control. He had worked too hard for this. When it was his turn, Thomas stood up, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Your Honor, I've worked this land for as long as I can remember. It's been in my family for generations. I've never turned my back on it, and I never will. These allegations are false." He gestured to the crowd, and the people here know that. They know what this land means to all of us. But there's something bigger going on here. Something that's not just about my farm. It's about the future of this entire region. The room fell silent as Thomas continued. "These people like Mr. Jennings, want to take control of everything. They want to turn our homes, our land, into profit. They don't care about the community. They only care about power. He looked directly at Jennings, who was sitting across from him. But we won't let that happen. Sheriff Walker stepped forward, his voice steady and authoritative. We've gathered evidence, Your Honor. We have records of illegal meetings, forged documents, and a web of connections between Mr. Jennings and his associates, all of whom have been involved in attempting to force landowners out of their properties. This is not just about Mr. Carter's farm. This is about a network of corruption that extends far beyond this courthouse. Owens presented the evidence they had worked so hard to gather: photos, emails, financial transactions. It was undeniable. The truth was out. Jennings's lawyer tried to fight back, but the tide had turned. The truth had a way of cutting through the lies, and now the judge saw it. He looked at the documents, glanced at Thomas, and then at Jennings, who had gone pale. After a long pause, the judge spoke. This court finds that the actions of Mr. Jennings and his associates constitute an attempt to manipulate and unlawfully acquire land. The case will proceed to a full investigation. Mr. Jennings, you are hereby ordered to cease and desist all actions regarding Mr. Carter's property and any other affected properties. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. The judge's gavel slammed down. The court is adjourned. Thomas stood there, his heart racing, as the weight of the moment finally hit him. He had won. Against all odds, he had fought back. Jennings and his lawyer shot him one last look of hatred before they were escorted out of the room by the deputies. Thomas turned to Sheriff Walker, Owens, and Fletcher, who were smiling in quiet relief. "We did it," Thomas said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We did," Owens replied. Thomas looked out over the crowd. The people who had stood by him, who had fought for their land, their homes. They had won too. It wasn't just about his farm anymore. It was about the people, about preserving their way of life. Later, as Thomas drove back to the farm, the field spread out before him, the wind rustling through the trees, he realized that the fight wasn't really over. There would always be people like Foster and Jennings, people who wanted to take and control. But Thomas knew one thing. As long as he had breath in his body, he would never let them take his land again. The fight for what was right would never truly end. But for today, for now, Thomas had won.